When we look at the state of the world today, what is most evident is that none of our global problems, energy shortages, environmental degradation, climate change, economic inequality, violence and war, none of these problems can be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they're all interconnected and interdependent. When we aggravate any one of them, the effects spread through the entire system, increasing and diversifying the other problems. In this video, I shall show you how this dynamic, if not understood, will make it very hard to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. On the other hand, recognition of the problem's systemic nature can help us to advance a number of SDGs at the same time, with much greater success than if they're dealt with in isolation. In fact, the systems approach is a powerful tool that can make all the difference. Let's take climate change, SDG 13, as an example. As you know, climate change is caused by excessive emissions of greenhouse gases, CO2 emissions in the burning of fossil fuels, and emissions of methane in the management of livestock. And since fossil fuels power virtually all industrial and economic processes, climate change now interlinks all these processes. From energy policy, SDG 7, to agriculture, SDG 2, transportation, SDG 11, manufacturing, SDG 9, and so on. In other words, climate change is a systemic problem. The excessive heat trapped by the greenhouse effect has resulted in the global warming of the Earth's atmosphere beyond safe levels. Now, warmer air means that there is excessive energy and excessive moisture in the atmosphere, which can lead to a wide variety of consequences: floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, but also droughts, heat waves and wildfires. Indeed, during recent years we have seen an intensification of all these climate catastrophes, with social, environmental and economic consequences no one can escape, no matter how rich and powerful. Droughts, hurricanes and floods result not only in billions of dollars of damage, but also in millions of climate refugees, which often trigger political unrests, violence and war. For example, the catastrophic civil war in Syria originated in a historic drought in 2006, which resulted in 1.5 million farmers migrating to the cities, where they exacerbated already existing political tensions. So we see that both the causes and the effects of climate change are all interconnected. This means that we need to also see the SDGs as systemically interconnected. What we need is systemic solutions, solutions that do not deal with any problem in isolation, but always within the context of other problems. The fundamental dilemma underlying our global problems seems to be the illusion that unlimited growth is possible on a finite planet. The belief in perpetual economic growth at all costs amounts to a clash between linear thinking and the non-linear patterns in our biosphere, the ecological networks and cycles that constitute the web of life. This highly non-linear global network contains countless feedback loops through which the planet balances and regulates itself. Our current economic system, by contrast, does not seem to recognize any limits. In this economic system, perpetual growth is pursued relentlessly by promoting excessive consumption and a throwaway economy that is energy and resource intensive, generating waste and pollution, depleting the Earth's natural resources, and increasing economic inequality. Moreover, these problems are exacerbated by global climate change, caused by our energy-intensive and fossil fuel-based technologies. Again, I want you to notice how all these problems, economic inequality, pollution, resource depletion, and so on, are all systemically interconnected. It seems then that our key challenge is to shift from an economic system based on the notion of unlimited growth to one that is both ecologically sustainable and socially just. No growth is not the answer, in my opinion, because growth is a central characteristic of all life. But growth in nature is not linear and unlimited. While certain parts of organisms or ecosystems grow, others decline, releasing and recycling their components, which become resources for new growth. This kind of balanced, multifaceted growth is well known to biologists and ecologists. I call it qualitative growth, to contrast it with the concept of quantitative growth, measured in terms of the undifferentiated index of the GDP used by today's economists. In fact, most of what is called growth today is waste, which means that we have essentially an economy of waste and destruction. Qualitative growth, by contrast, is growth that enhances the quality of life through generation and regeneration. In living organisms, ecosystems, and societies, qualitative growth includes an increase of complexity, sophistication, and maturity. So we need to qualify growth. Instead of assessing the state of the economy in terms of the crude quantitative measure of GDP, we need to distinguish between good growth and bad growth, and then increase the former and decrease the latter. Now, from an ecological point of view, the distinction between good growth and bad growth is obvious. Bad growth is growth of production processes and services that externalizes social and environmental costs, thereby harming local communities and damaging the environment without necessarily being aware of the full extent of the problems one is creating. Bad growth is based on fossil fuels, involves toxic substances, depletes our natural resources, and degrades the Earth's ecosystems. Good growth is the opposite of all that. It is growth of more efficient production processes and services that involve renewable energies, zero emissions, continuing recycling of natural resources, support of local communities, and restoration of the Earth's ecosystems. As you know, many UN member states are seriously exploring and implementing these approaches. Now, the focus on qualitative growth is fully consistent with a new conception of life that has emerged in science over the past 30 years. At the forefront of contemporary science, the universe is no longer seen as some kind of machine composed of elementary building blocks. We have discovered that the material world ultimately is a network of inseparable patterns of relationships. That the planet as a whole is a living, self-regulating system. The view of the human body as a machine and of the mind as a separate entity is now being replaced by one that sees not only the brain, but also the immune system, the bodily tissues, in fact every single cell, as a living cognitive system. Evolution is no longer seen as a competitive struggle for existence, but rather as some kind of cooperative dance in which creativity and the constant emergence of novelty are the driving forces. And with a new emphasis on complexity, networks, and patterns of organization, a new science of qualities is slowly emerging. During the last 30 years, I developed a synthesis of this new understanding of life, a conceptual framework that integrates 4 dimensions of life: the biological dimension, the cognitive, the social, and the ecological dimension. I call my synthesis the systems view of life because it involves a new kind of thinking in terms of relationships, patterns, and context. And in science, this way of thinking is known as systems thinking or systemic thinking. At the very heart of the change of paradigms from the mechanistic to the systemic view of life, we find a fundamental change of metaphors from seeing the world as a machine to understanding it as a network. Now, a network, as everybody knows, is a certain pattern of links, of relationships. And therefore, to understand networks, we need to be able to think in terms of patterns and in terms of relationships. And this is what systems thinking is all about. To use a popular phrase, it means knowing how to connect the dots. As I've mentioned, systems thinking is of crucial importance to the successful implementation of the SDGs. What we are concerned with here is how to connect the dots so that we all, including the UN member states, can use the powerful tools of the systems approach to meet their individual challenges in time by the 2030 deadline. In particular, systems thinking is critical in our endeavor to build sustainable communities at all levels. Since its introduction in the early 1980s, the concept of sustainability has often been distorted, co-opted, and even trivialized by being used without the ecological context that gives it its proper meaning. What is sustained in a sustainable community is not economic growth or competitive advantage, but the entire web of life on which our long-term survival depends. In other words, a sustainable community is designed in such a way that its ways of life, its businesses, economy, physical structures and technologies respect, honor, and cooperate with nature's inherent ability to sustain life. Now, the first step in this endeavor, naturally, must be to understand how nature sustains life. Over billions of years of evolution, the Earth's ecosystems have evolved certain principles of organization to sustain the web of life. Knowledge of these principles of organization, or principles of ecology, also known as ecological literacy or eco-literacy, is crucial for designing sustainable human communities. In the coming decades, the survival of humanity will literally depend on our ecological literacy, on our ability to understand the basic principles of ecology and to live accordingly. This means that ecoliteracy must become a critical skill for our politicians, business leaders, and professionals in all spheres, and should be the most important part of education at all levels, from primary and secondary schools to colleges and universities, and the continuing education and training of professionals. All of us, including our children, our students, and our political and corporate leaders, need to be in a process of constant transformative learning. If you wish, we need to truly understand the basic facts of life. For example, how one species' waste is another species' food. How matter cycles continually through the web of life. How the energy driving those ecological cycles flows from the sun. How diversity increases resilience. And how life, from its beginning, more than 3 billion years ago, did not take over the planet by combat, but by networking, by partnerships. Now it turns out that all these principles of ecology are closely interrelated. They are just different aspects of a single fundamental pattern of organization that has enabled nature to sustain life for billions of years. In a nutshell, nature sustains life by creating and nurturing communities. No individual organism can exist in isolation. Animals depend on the photosynthesis of plants for their energy needs. Plants depend on the carbon dioxide produced by animals, as well as on the nitrogen fixed by bacteria and other microorganisms at their roots. And together, plants, animals, and microorganisms regulate the entire biosphere and maintain the conditions conducive to life. These patterns of organization are of central importance to sustain the entire community of life, including human life. So we see that sustainability is not an individual property, but a property of an entire web of relationships. It always involves a whole community. This is the profound lesson we need to learn from nature. The way to sustain life is to build and nurture communities from local to global levels. Now I want to come back to the heart of the matter. The realization that the major problems of our time are systemic problems, all interconnected and interdependent. This means that they require corresponding systemic solutions, solutions that do not solve any problem in isolation, but rather within the context of the other problems. Let me give you an example of a systemic solution par excellence, and this is from the field of agriculture. If we changed from our chemical, large-scale industrial agriculture to organic, community-oriented, sustainable farming, this would contribute significantly to solving a whole array of big problems. It would greatly reduce our energy dependence related to SDG 7, because we are now using, at least in the United States, 20% of our fossil fuels to grow, process and transport food. The healthy, organically grown food would hugely improve public health, SDG 3, because many chronic diseases, heart diseases, stroke, diabetes and so on, are directly linked to our diet. Organic farming would also contribute significantly to alleviating climate change, SDG 13. Why? Because an organic soil is rich in carbon, which means that it draws down CO2 from the atmosphere and locks it up in organic matter. Alleviating climate change, in turn, will reduce the number of people whose lives are uprooted by disasters as houses, livelihoods and infrastructures are swept away, and therefore will reduce the global flows of climate refugees. Taken together, all this would greatly reduce internal and international tensions. Well, this is only one example of a systemic solution. Over the last few decades, the research institutes and centers of learning of the global civil society have developed and proposed hundreds of such solutions all over the world, each bringing with it a wide array of improvements in the areas of many other goals. They include proposals to reshape economic globalization and restructure corporations, new forms of ownership that are not extractive but generative, a wide variety of systemic solutions to the interlinked problems of energy, food, poverty and climate change. And finally, the large number of systemic design solutions known as eco-design, which embody the basic principles of ecology. Recognizing such solutions and understanding their effectiveness is of utmost importance, so that we can build upon and scale up what already exists and expand what we know. This is extremely important if we are to reach the SDGs on schedule, or indeed at all. My textbook can give you the conceptual tools to understand the nature of our systemic problems and to recognize the systemic solutions that are being developed by individuals and organizations around the world. In addition, I'm teaching an online course based on the textbook, which I would be happy to make available to you. It is called Capra course, and it consists of 12 pre-recorded lectures plus a discussion forum in which I participate every day during the duration of the course, interacting with the course participants. My conclusion from an extensive review of the existing systemic solutions is that the new systemic understanding of life has given us the knowledge and the technologies to solve our major problems and build a sustainable future. I know that working together we can reach the SDGs by 2030, provided we use all the tools at our disposal. What we need is for all civil society organizations and those strategists and decision makers actually working within governments to apply the systemic tools currently at our disposal and build on the existing political will and leadership, as well as on collaborative relationships at a global level through the United Nations. To conclude, I want to ask a simple question. If we have all the knowledge and the technology to build a sustainable world, why don't we do it? When we reflect on this critical question, we soon realize that the conceptual level is not the whole story. We also need to deal with values and ethics. Now, ethics is usually associated with philosophy and religion, but it can also be considered from a scientific perspective. Throughout the long history of evolution, nature has sustained life by creating and nurturing communities, as I have mentioned. As soon as the first cells appeared on Earth, they formed tightly interlinked communities known as bacterial colonies, and for billions of years, nature has maintained such communities at all levels of life. Natural selection favors those communities in which the individuals act for the benefit of the community as a whole. In the human realm, we call this ethical behavior. So ethics always has to do with community. It is behavior for the common good. Today, we all belong to many communities, but we all share two communities to which we belong. We are all members of humanity, and we all belong to the global biosphere, the community of life. We are members of oikos, the earth household, which is the Greek root of the word ecology. And as such, we should behave as the other members of the household behave. The plants, animals, and microorganisms that form the vast network of relationships that we call the web of life. The outstanding characteristic of the biosphere is its inherent ability to sustain life. As members of the global community of living beings, it behooves us to behave in such a way that we respect, honor, and cooperate with nature's inherent ability to sustain life. As I've mentioned, this is the very essence of ecological sustainability. As members of the human community, our behavior should reflect a respect of human dignity and human rights. And since human life encompasses biological, cognitive, social, and cultural dimensions, human rights should be respected in all of these dimensions. To lay this out in detail is quite a challenge. But fortunately, we have a magnificent document that covers the broad range of human dignity and human rights. This document is the Earth Charter. It was initiated at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 and was written in the subsequent years in a unique collaborative effort involving many groups, NGOs, indigenous peoples, and other groups around the world. The Earth Charter is a declaration of 16 values and principles for building a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. It was published first in 2000, and when you read it today, you will see it is still fully valid. It is really a magnificent summary of the kind of Earth ethics we need today. To adopt and implement the ethical principles of the Earth Charter is an enterprise that transcends all our differences of race, culture, or class. The Earth is our common home, and creating a sustainable world for our children and for future generations is our common task.